diverse constituency, but also a constituency where in our borough, we've got the stats kind of showing about 1 in 10 women, particularly with victims, but a lot of that representative women reporting domestic abuse and seeking domestic abuse support and services as well. And around the time, again, I mean, about a year ago, there was also the Domestic Violence Commission that was launched at a local level in Barking and Dagenham Council, the first of its kind, which has just sort of reached some of its conclusions, and hopefully other councils can learn about it as well. So for me, it was quite looking at it, trying to look at it a little bit more from a local perspective. And last week, when the bill, which has been on quite a journey in the last 3 years, is starting to reach its concluding stages at the moment, and these are real crucial parts now of this specific bill and its passage through Parliament. I spoke last week, and I did something that I didn't think I would do. I didn't actually ever think I would do, and I hadn't planned to do ever in my public role. Although the issue of domestic abuse is something so personal for me, so raw for me, but also something that I wanted to speak about or do work on as the chair of the APPG on domestic abuse as well. It was one of those first things that I did after I got elected, was meet with the organisations that were doing work in Parliament on this and the MPs, and start that conversation going, because from a distance away from Parliament, I could really see some of the big gaping holes in terms of the legislation and the overall approach as well. And I will come on to some of that a little bit later. But I just want to say that, I also, like, just from my perspective, I made a disclosure last week that I didn't think I would make ever actually in a public role, but I did say that I have experienced it. I've been subjected to it, and I recognize that for me it's a lifelong journey to heal and to deal with it. And I feel I know in a lot of ways, I can't speak for every survivor, every victim, but I recognize the amount of work that still needs to be done as well in terms of improving the law in this area. The next thing I wanted to sort of mention was just what I did speak about in the speech, and I'm sure many of you have come across this before as well, that the bill still is missing specific provisions to protect migrant women. And where the bill is right now is that it went through its second reading, it went through committee reading, and it then went to the House of Lords, and it was sort of met with a number of amendments to the bill, which were not passed at second reading, which the government, I suppose, in a lot of ways didn't entertain and didn't feel it could commit to. And one of those amendments was on the protections for migrant women, for them to be able to access support, particularly refuge support, without necessarily having to sort of show, or having to have the immigration status that is seen as sufficient for support. And that was really important. I think that one of the reasons why it's really important is because we've seen, I'm sure we can all appreciate, and we've seen just how much the impact of COVID-19, for example, has had on those with no recourse to public funds, right? So we know the increase in food bank usage, we know the types of people that are coming to those food banks, and a lot of them do reflect migrant women, women who've lost their jobs, can't be furloughed, or are working in the pandemic as well, with those insecure immigration statuses. But again, through the lens, if you like, of suspicion, is what they're viewed as, when it comes to seeking support for domestic abuse. Because, and I deal with this a lot in my constituency office. A lot of the time the accusations are that they are exaggerating, or that they're even lying about their experience of domestic abuse, because they're so desperate to, for whatever reason, so desperate to get indefinite leave to remain. And I think that's a real sad indictment of the situation for migrant women, in particular, migrant survivors of domestic abuse, but also just shows the precarity of the situation that many survivors of abuse find themselves in. They can go from having a sort of safety net to some degree to completely, stand without any particular support. And it was really important, I think, and I think it is still going forward, to keep campaigning, MPs like myself, to keep campaigning on this and to keep highlighting the impact. What we do know is that the government have committed to a 1.5 million pilot program with Southall Black Sisters, targeted specifically to migrant women, to try and understand, they say, a little bit better about the experiences, and then for that to inform what would be a more permanent or a long-term sustainable program. I have concerns about it, and I have raised that in terms of, again, it comes to the data sharing between government departments, particularly the Home Office, where already on the one hand, there's such a high threshold to prove domestic abuse, where a migrant victim might not even have access to their citizenship documents and applications and things like that. And then on the other, we do know it's a very restrictive, increasingly inaccessible immigration system overall as well. So concerns around that, and concerns that actually have been raised by a number of bodies, from the IOPC to the College of Policing, speaking about the fact that actually this is a threat to it causes harm. The threat and risk posed to the public is significant when the data sharing does happen with immigration enforcement and other bodies which actually look at immigration status and recourse to public funds. The next point I guess I wanted to make was that, the fact that the IOPC, the College of Policing, and other bodies have talked about it in that way in terms of the impact on the public, I think means that, there needs to be a greater way of looking at domestic abuse through the lens of taking a real public health approach to it. And I think that's really what needs to happen next as well. And that's why I'm quite pleased to be able to join this event and have this conversation with you today, because I certainly know in my role as the chair of the APPG in domestic violence and abuse, we have done and we will continue to do a lot of work in terms of domestic abuse and the criminal justice system. But we do want to open up space now to also really look into domestic abuse and the public health approach, and really looking at it in that way. There's been a lot, I think, that's been sort of said and debated since the tragic murder of Sarah Everard. And I think it's brought to light in a lot of ways as well, the ideas around what does justice look like, and what does supporting victims of gendered violence and abuse look like, and what is meaningful. Is it, emboldening or boosting the criminal justice system? And many could say that strengthening laws around dealing with perpetrators and stuff doesn't actually deal with the root issues. Or is it, looking at these issues also in terms of how do healthcare services respond, recognize, and also actually ensure there's restorative justice as well embedded in healthcare as well. And that's I think going to be quite key as well going forward, especially as we are, all that is being said right now in terms of coming out of the pandemic recovery, and healthcare being such a huge important aspect of that in terms of what should our country, what should our world look like beyond the pandemic. And I think that's where the next focus should really be. And I'm keen to engage yourselves, engage other bodies, other organizations, student groups in particular as well towards that, because I think there's a lot of information sharing, there's a lot of perspective that can actually be brought to this particular area. So I'm actually going to stop here because I'm really keen to participate in hopefully a sort of a bit more of an open discussion. Happy to obviously take questions, but also just have maybe a to and fro conversation here about your perspectives, the work that's happening in KCL, and maybe think about how we can maybe move together on that agenda as well, the public health agenda.
Thank you so much for talking. And yeah, just sorry, my brain. Just thank you for talking about this, and I think we would love to have like a back and forth conversation with you, since it is such an intimate group. So we will open the floor to questions, so feel free to type it in, or if you're comfortable, just unmute yourself and ask whatever you feel like asking. I think something that we were wondering is like, now that the domestic abuse bill that you have been working on for so long is kind of in its final stages, like what are some of the future directions for the work of the APPG?
Yeah, so I think it's really interesting because since the bill came with Lord's amendments last week, if it goes back, so if there's a vote and it doesn't get supported, and the various amendments don't get supported, and there were released, I think, 82 amendments that were tabled, and of course there were some that were, accepted by the government and some that weren't. There are many that then now have gone back to the House of Lords and are now coming back. So it's a ping pong like with many other bills. So there's going to be what is called a Lord's message on Monday, which is going to incorporate some of those outstanding amendments that didn't get accepted, almost as a final push. Now, I think what can be maybe expected at that stage is that, again, maybe not a lot of those amendments get accepted, but I do know that there is some lobbying going on around particular ones, specifically, for example, around the stalking register, MAPA, it's known as, and to really get the government to concede on that one, for example. And there's lots of lobbying going on publicly, privately on those specific ones. So it's, I'd say, in a lot of ways, a crucial stage in some ways with the bill, because it's not quite over yet, and we'll probably know a lot more next week where things stand. I think it's one of those things as well that, it's a landmark piece of legislation. Once it sort of goes past that stage and receives royal assent, it then obviously becomes a conversation more around how much of it and how is it implemented and how is it enforced, I suppose, in the parts that relate to the criminal justice system. So I think those things would be actually, again, ongoing sort of work for the next few years, to really just put into practice those elements of the bill. But I also do think that there is scope as well to keep continuing on some of the areas that haven't necessarily been considered to take forward. But I do think the next piece of work, I think, for the domestic abuse APPG is one, looking at the public health agenda, and to really look at, the NHS services, to really look at how different parts of our healthcare system respond to domestic abuse. And I think two of the other pieces of work that we're doing is one on young people and young victims of domestic abuse. A lot of the time, obviously, I think we are obviously quite rightly speaking about women victims of domestic abuse, but really looking at children that are impacted. What's come out through the conversations and the evidences that we've taken so far are things like how much we hear about sort of fatal incidents related to domestic abuse, and how there's maybe one or two mentions about a child that may have been involved, or a child that is caught up in all of this, but we don't know enough about what goes on to happen to a child that has witnessed, experienced, and lives with the impact of domestic abuse. So that's a piece of work that we're doing currently. And the second piece of work on top of that is actually looking at honor-based abuse. So that's another area that I'm very keen to look at. It's something that is very close to my heart, but also just something that I wanted to push because there had been an APPG with that specific name. I'm not sure of the activity on it, but the campaigners, organisations, individuals are really keen to see it pressed in the domestic abuse bill, because currently there isn't a statutory definition even of honour-based abuse. So it's something that's redefined by organisations, campaign organisations, but it's not something that's even recognised at present in the domestic abuse bill. So a big piece of work to be done there, I think, overall. I think it needs to be brought to light, and I think it needs to be understood, because I think it's commonly misunderstood, and it's not necessarily deemed a form of domestic abuse. Or the relationship between honour-based abuse and domestic abuse is not necessarily drawn about in the same way. And likewise, I think in the grand scheme of things, or if you like, the backdrop of sort of seeing domestic abuse strategies being taken and being sat apart from VOG strategies overall. I think, it's really important to make sure that I think legislators kind of make sure that these things are incorporated under like VOG, because they interrelate so much. I mean, talking about stalking relates to domestic abuse in often cases. So therefore, like things like honor-based abuse need to be seen in that context as well. So those are the kind of three kind of areas that we're kind of going to be focusing on in the next year or two. And we've started taking evidence and meeting with organizations, campaigners, survivors on all of these three fronts.
Thank you so much for that answer. Does anyone else have any questions? Anything? Oh, is there a raised hand? Oh, Rebecca.
Yeah. Hi, thank you so much for speaking, Apsana. It's really interesting to hear your perspective on these things. I think one thing that particularly struck me when you were talking is you mentioned restorative justice as you were speaking about sort of a public health approach, or healthcare in general. And I just wondered if you could speak a bit more about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, it really comes down to, what are these solutions in terms of trying to eradicate domestic abuse from society, right? And I say this partly as a survivor. I say this partly as, looking at some of the evidence around dealing with perpetrators. I would like to see maybe in some ways an evaluation, a public policy evaluation, a legislative evaluation in terms of perpetrator programs, how much they're able to rehabilitate, if you like, or change the behaviors, the misogyny. How much does it actually change that? And how effective is also the criminal justice system in terms of dealing with perpetrators of domestic abuse, especially when you look at things like reoffending rates and things like that. And we talk about serial abusers, serial stalkers, and there are question marks, I think, in terms of how much the criminal justice system at present in its current place can deal with that. But is also the answer then to embolden it, to make it stronger in terms of recognizing. And I think it's important to recognize, like we are now recognizing misogyny as a hate crime, for example. It's really important to be able to have that information ready there and understood in the way that it should be understood. But if, for example, the next step with that one in particular is, X number of years need to be attached for somebody that commits a crime which, relates to, which is deemed misogyny, does that then also, solve the problems? And I'm not sure that it does. And I think by restorative justice, I think we do have to think about how people who commit these crimes and are, perpetrators, how is it that they are rehabilitated into society where we still have to deal with the problem of the fact that they may go on to still abuse, and how I think there needs to be a rethinking in terms of that overall. And some of that I think needs to be through looking at it through the lens of a public health approach to a degree. And a lot of that needs to be, preventative work as well. And I think there's so much to learn in terms of other types of crime that may also be gendered to a degree. I mean, I think there's been a lot that's been learned, for example, in terms of how do we tackle knife crime, for example, which, is something quite different in a lot of ways, but it's still violence. And I think there needs to be a similar approach now that is now taken to really think about preventative work, and also restorative work in terms of we need to eradicate it for everyone. And yes, it's male violence a lot of the time that's responsible for domestic abuse, but then we also need to look at ways in which that can be eradicated, and that's going to need to take a different approach as well.
So you kind of briefly mentioned like preventative work, and like I think we all see the importance of that. And also in addition to the domestic abuse bill, the government has also taken action by introducing like statutory guidance for relationships and sex education. And I just wanted to ask your opinion on the role that comprehensive RSC plays in reducing domestic abuse or even preventing it.
So it's quite interesting because I've been thinking about this recently, especially in terms of my role on the education committee, and also in light of like the recent kind of incidents and stories that have been coming out about sexual harassment in educational settings. And I think there's a number of things here. I think some things need to be improved in terms of the curriculum, I believe, in terms of particularly girls and safeguarding, and being able to tackle that much better. Some work has been done at higher education level, but I think much lower down. I think it needs to be a bit more robust in terms of what is taught at schools. I think we've only in the last 3 to 4 years really started to recognize domestic abuse for what it is and all the different types of various forms that it takes. So whilst there's a lot of work in the curriculum that's done in terms of gendered violence maybe and violence against women, it really doesn't maybe necessarily go into looking at other forms like beyond domestic violence, domestic abuse, post separation control, all these kind of things that there is evidence to and terms for it, but not necessarily something that is taught at that age. It brings about questions around age appropriateness and things like that, but I think certainly at secondary school age, I think some of these things need to be embedded a little bit more into the curriculum, and really specifically around safeguarding, specifically around girls, and I think some of that is missing at present. And often I think with what's happened with this bill in particular is that I think there has been a little bit of a culture shift, because it is now a specific bill that is trying to incorporate and trying to recognize these forms. Before this, people were talking about domestic violence as domestic violence and weren't even talking about the non-violent types of abuse. So it's important to recognize that, but I think also some of the things that are taught in school, I mean, things around bullying, some things around online harms, all of those things need to really embed and connect up in a way that explores examples, material that actually touches upon domestic abuse and gendered violence, and also looks at it in a quite an integrated way. Because I remain a little bit concerned about, for example, this government's current approach to VOG, which is to separate out the domestic abuse strategy, although I've been given assurances that that's not really what's happening, and that it's there right now because it's to provide a sort of dedicated attention, if you like, to the issue of domestic abuse. I think it's so important to make sure that all the education that is done at that in those ages is done in a way that sort of looks at it, looks at the picture as a whole, and is able to sort of relate to younger people in particular, how the various different experiences can interconnect and are naturally sort of related to one another. So I mean, I welcome like the RSC agenda in terms of what it's doing right now, in terms of secondary school age. I think it could go further in terms of the domestic abuse agenda, and really trying to do that work around healthy relationships and gendered inequalities in our society.
Yeah, thank you for that. We do teach a healthy relationships like lesson at schools, and we definitely try to see domestic abuse as like financial abuse. Like there are so many different forms, but I guess time and money is always such a big limitation. But also something that I think worried us when we saw the statutory RSC guidance is that it doesn't create a framework for schools with different a different level of means, or like a different student body to like have like similar standards of RSC that they give out. So sorry, I didn't form that well. I think I'm just
Fine. I'm quite curious actually. I mean, do you mean in terms of like schools might not necessarily like they might be giving guidance to sort of guide the curriculums and implement them, but not necessarily the financial backing to be able to cover the things that may really be needed, and also like it might vary between school to school, right? Like in terms of their specific needs. It's quite important for me to note that in a lot of ways, because I mean, this is just using a local anecdote. I've had some schools say to me, that they want to deliver work on particular areas. I mean, I've had one school, for example, talk to me about healthy relationships, and work around RSC. But they've talked to me about how different schools take different approaches, but they want to focus on one or two things in particular. Like they wanted to focus on young girls, women, and casteism and shadism and things like that. And they see that like a lot of young women are talking about sort of body image, or like they're not talking about it, but they see manifestations of how like unhealthy views develop, but they don't necessarily have the resource to be able to deliver it. So it's quite interesting to hear that from yourselves as well. I wonder, maybe is partly about me going away just to look at who delivers this work, because is it yourself that goes yourselves you go around? Is it on a voluntary basis that you do this in school?
Yes, so we hold training yearly, and we have different lessons plans, and we have like bullet points of the things that each volunteer talks about. But again, sometimes it depends on the volunteer's experience and comfort level. Sometimes it depends on the student body. So definitely like going to different schools that are like at different levels of academic like how do I say this? Like, like grammar schools versus public schools and like things like that. There's definitely a difference on how we like can approach subjects, or how in depth we can go into certain topics. And I was just wondering, like, it's such a big thing to learn to combat. But yeah.
Yeah, that's helpful to know, because I mean, just some of the recent work that I've been doing in the education committee was just looking at uh, the flexibilities, if you like, of like a more devolved kind of education system. And I don't think the word is regulation, but sort of just looking at how what flexibility there is, and what then does manifest itself in terms of education. And I think some of the curriculum guidance is actually quite flexible. Some things are obviously mandated, but even within that, there's like flexibility in terms of material and things like that. But there are so many factors, right, in terms of what results in a particular school not necessarily delivering all of their material. And on the one hand, context is important, and on the other hand, some things are just really needed in particular schools and in environments to focus on in particular.
Yeah, I agree. I think we've got a question from Maria.
Sorry. I think so. I just want to say thank you for being so like honest and open with us about this and like, conversing with us. There was something that I really appreciate the integration that you mentioned about different factors. So it's like domestic abuse doesn't just stand alone by itself. It's obviously not just something that happens, right? And I was wondering, with regards to prevention and education in schools, I think, Uma, you were talking about different like academic standards, so grammar schools, public schools, but I was wondering if like there's also a more regional aspect to it. So, for example, some areas will have schools with a higher population of like a minority, an ethnic minorities words. Ethnic minority, whereas others will have a higher population of others, right? So I was wondering how the culture of the student body kind of, how does that how do you kind of approach different populations within these schools and have constructive conversations with them, because I think, especially, for example, for my culture, it's not really something that we talk about very much. I don't know if that made sense.
I'll try and answer it. I mean, I think some of it is obviously going to be the obvious kind of, we just need ambassadors, if you like, like champions and ambassadors of issues that are just taboo issues in some communities and uncomfortable in some places. I think all of these things are uncomfortable in a lot of ways, or have been, for various different groups and communities at various different stages. And I think that it's always important to be able to support, sort of boost and give platform to the voices that are already there, that and obviously those with expertise in those areas. That's why I sort of try and look at, for example, with honor-based abuse, for example, the work that's been done, the experts in the field, researchers in particular, to kind of highlight their work, because they have investigated, researched, looked, and actually, sometimes, when I speak to them, they've told me that they've 20 years it's taken for them to be able to formulate a meaningful focus group, to be able to, because people are not necessarily willing to come forward to talk about their experiences, right, and to talk about it in a natural way where they're not fearful of what repercussions may come. I think some of this we also need to recognize that there are a number of pieces of laws and legislation that have passed in over numerous years and decades that haven't necessarily empowered some of the ethnic minority communities. So we know about our history of racism. We know even the legacies around immigration, the immigration system, which is still creating and fostering a hostile environment, right? So when I look at educational settings, for example, I know one or two things, which is that I know the impact of, for example, the prevent duty on many ethnic minority communities, and just how sometimes children have been policed for just saying the word Syria, for example, in school, like and they're just curious because they've seen something on TV, and just how disproportionately some communities are targeted through some laws. And I think it's worth bearing that in mind in terms of some of the barriers we may have. I also don't know if it's just the role of us as those of us that are ethnic minorities to take up that role to try and sort of, I don't know, fix, if you like, what's wrong, and I think sometimes those approaches can be a little bit counterproductive. But it is important, I think, to really recognize that there is that gaze, if you like, from the external that otherizes communities all the time. And it's important to I think one of the ways in which to overcome it is to work on ways in which we can relate some of these the oppressions, the experiences of these types of abuse to in the wider context, and to try and explain how actually this is gendered abuse, or this is still relates to patriarchal structures that need dismantling. And I think that is actually quite helpful. I mean, just to give you an example, with honor-based abuse, for example, which is traditionally sort of seen as either a Muslim problem or a South Asian problem, or a global South problem. I mean, one of the things that's been is on the cards at the moment is whether or not there should be a statutory definition, but also whether the term should be gotten rid of altogether. And some of the debates and discussions that produces is, well, if you don't define it, then it's sort of left without any meaning. How do you then describe it? And if you do define it, are you then defining it in a way which otherizes communities and treats it as though it's a specific problem of the honor code, which only exists in some communities and can only be understood in that context? And I think that is unhelpful, because it obviously stops victims coming forward, it stops people coming forward for support, and ultimately doesn't actually help with making any progress on this on this matter, because it's just sort of seen as something that is a form of abuse, is a form of oppression, and people then just don't necessarily want to sort of see it as a an issue that needs to be dealt with. It's just, no, actually this is our, and I think this comes up as well, I mean, in terms of like looking at cultures and things, right? So it's sort of like, oh, honor-based abuse, that's to do with culture, and I think we just need to make sure that there is that shift that continues to keep happening about talking about it just as another form of domestic abuse, another form of gendered violence, you know, and that's so important to continue to contextualize it in that way and explain it as what it is, which is a form of, you know, patriarchal oppression.
Thank you so much. I also just want to follow up on one of the other that you mentioned. You said something about public health. I was wondering more on a kind of practical level, how is there kind of changes that can be made within policy within the NHS that can make it easier for kind of for women to come forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think there must be, like, and that's why I'm sort of keen for parliamentarians to, you know, sit down and really look at this and look at what experts are saying, look at what's going on right now. I mean, I'll give an example. Recently, we had the government announced the ANI scheme, so which was the ANI scheme, which is you can go into specific pharmacies and basically, you know, asked to be seen in a separate room and then speak to them, and sort of that's an outlet to be able to say, I'm a victim of domestic abuse. I've just, you know, got this space with you now, and if I use the word, I want to speak down here, I want to, you know, that gives a trigger and gives a sort of a safety signal to say, like, I need help. And then you've got, you know, we've got things like, we know GPs, you know, and you know, the GP bodies do train GPs, for example, to spot signs of abuse, to ask questions. But I do think we need to look at this again, review it, and see how it can really be drawn out further. And it's not drawn out further by, I don't know, I've heard some things around, you know, what if there were police officers in A&Es, you know, ready to intervene when a domestic abuse victim arrives with lots of injuries, for example. I'm not sure that's what I'm talking about. I think I'm talking more about like having sort of, for example, being able to provide quicker support to domestic abuse victims. If we're talking about the fact that the statistics show the most dangerous time or the most highest risk point of a abuse victim is when they escape, you know, and making sure, let's look at that trajectory of when are the most dangerous points and look at how public health can have a stronger approach in those particular moments, because it's not, you know, it is about recognition, it's about being able to spot, it's about being able to ask the right questions, particularly when we know, again, the research showing that a lot of people don't know that they are victims of abuse, they don't recognize the abuse, and so, you know, those real questions around being able to support a victim to recognize signs of abuse. And I think that there should be a greater responsibility there in terms of public health, and also, like, I mean, not in a sort of flippant way, but I do think it's just overall for our healthcare system, it makes our healthcare system more robust, because, you know, what we are seeing still even now is a domestic abuse victim may turn up, may not, but may turn up with or have a long medical history or a hospital history of visiting, getting support, but actually, you know, like, isn't the right thing is for it, wouldn't the right thing be, you know, for everybody if the violence stopped and that they weren't, you know, having all these long-term and short-term or really severe health issues as a result of abuse, right? So it's those kind of things. I think what needs to happen with the agenda is to move beyond some of the, you know, obvious things around, right, spotting, recognizing, and actually move forward in terms of, okay, how do we actually eradicate it, but have a, a, a good approach in terms of public health that actually provides support to victims. And I think, I don't know the answer yet, but those are the kind of things that I think we're going to start exploring now.
Yeah, thank you. I guess your comments about kind of educating people, or I think there was something that you said about Oh, yes. So for victims to be able to recognize the signs of abuse, right? Because a lot of people don't actually know stuff like financial abuse or emotional abuse. And I guess that kind of links back to education in schools and the understanding of what healthy boundaries and relationships are. But yeah, thank you.
Do we have any final questions? Oh, Rebecca, go on.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I've been really enjoying this discussion so far. I think one thing that I just wanted to mention and just sort of hear your thoughts on, Apsana, would be around sort of the gendering of how we talk about domestic violence and abuse. And I realise there's obviously the need to look after women and to challenge the patriarchal systems that we still find ourselves in. But I wondered sort of within the bill and within sort of policy in general, if there's ways we can make our approach to this more gender inclusive and more supportive. Maybe people who aren't getting care because they're not sort of our typical image of a domestic abuse victim.
Absolutely, Rebecca, and I really want to push on that because I do think that maybe in the last year or two there's been a bit of a shift which has tried to kind of move away from really taking a really inclusive approach, particularly to gendered violence. And I think there is a lot of work to be done. Again, we're looking at this all in the backdrop of like really terrible things that are happening in terms of, for example, the rolling back on the Gender Recognition Act. Yesterday, I just saw that there's going to be evidence taken by a number of questionable organisations by the Equalities Committee on the Gender Recognition Act, for example. And I think it's really important that we do recognise, I think, some of this really simple but really shocking facts around domestic violence and abuse, like, for example, trans women experiencing being representative really high in terms of the domestic abuse figures, even though they may be a small number among the women community as a whole, but they are in the bracket of the most severe and the most high numbers of domestic abuse. So we can't eradicate this unless we support the most vulnerable and the most at risk, even within the vulnerable groups. So supporting the most vulnerable among the vulnerable, I think, is always an important approach to make. And of course, looking at intersectionality, although I think almost in some ways, we're almost as though we're treating the world as though we're post-intersectional, and I don't know why, but I think in some ways, intersectionality has become such a word that's been so misused and so misunderstood, is really recognizing that, for example, when it comes to domestic abuse, every single experience of somebody's is different, but also, like, you can't even relate. I think it's just so difficult to be able to relate, for example, an ethnic minority woman's experience to a disabled woman's experience of domestic abuse. And again, in the work that we're going to be doing next is to really start to look at that, because domestic abuse bill was in some ways quite vast, quite big. It's seen as a landmark piece of legislation. I know other countries are sort of looking at theirs now, Australia, New Zealand, and so forth. But to really start looking at some of the real detail of like how different survivors and victims experience it is going to be really, really key. And I do agree with you about making sure that is inclusive as possible, and also the fact that the impact of other laws also impact things like our approach to domestic abuse. What's going to happen with the Gender Recognition Act is going to have an impact for domestic abuse victims. It's going to have an impact in terms of how well maybe this bill on domestic abuse, is successfully implemented, right? They're also not sort of separate from one another, I don't think.
Thank you. Yeah, I think your points on intersectionality and needing to look at sort of the role of other laws and things within that are really important, and hopefully we can see some change there. I think that kind of links onto the follow-up question I wanted to ask, which was something we're really passionate about at Students for Global Health, and I think Sexpression as well, is really advocating and getting involved and campaigning on issues that we think are important for public health, global health, and just our world in general, I suppose. Yeah, I guess my question would be, what are ways in which we can get involved in sort of supporting all this work and all these things we've been talking about today and campaigning on this issue?
Yeah, I mean, that's brilliant. And I mean, I was just going to say one more thing, which was, you know, I see a lot of the work that's being done by women parliamentarians in particular. I suppose that's why we need even more women in parliament. But like, for example, when they do work around women's health issues, right? And a lot of those things are because, you know, there are certain conditions, certain illnesses that are not necessarily recognized, whether that's, you know, women at work and like looking at menopause policies, you know, and leave from work. And, you know, that's something that's, you know, I know when I worked in the NHS, that was something that was just starting to be looked at in terms of the nurses profession, for example, and that was the NHS itself, and that was only 2 years ago. So I think it's important to look maybe at domestic violence in the same way, although like that might sound a little bit odd. Why would we want to sort of treat it as though it's an illness or treat it as though it's a condition? It's not, but at the same time, we're looking, you know, we want to be able to look at the impacts on survivors and the fact that, you know, how these relate to the experience of domestic abuse in order to be able to take a better approach in terms of public health. And I think that's why it's important to have these conversations and to take things forward, because I think a lot of the work that you do is obviously going out to places and having those interactions in your day to day. I hope in some ways our conversation today maybe, I don't know, like it creates a space for even yourselves to kind of go away in your particular areas of work and your fields to maybe think about when you are interacting with people, even some of those things around how can an approach be better done in terms of domestic abuse and public health. And I think what would be really good is perhaps if we stay in touch, and I stay in touch in terms of the chair of the APPG and Women's Aid, who are the secretariat. I mean, I let them know as well in terms of your interest in this area and any ways in which you can help contribute that to any sort of work of ours, any inquiries that come up, that would be, you know, really good as well. And I'm sure that would be really, really welcome.
Thank you so much. Yeah, would be very happy to contribute in any way possible. I think we, both of our groups, have sort of national charities as well, and it's definitely something which we can lobby our national groups to get involved with as well, and something which we'd like to see more of.
Yeah, and I'm quite keen to see, like, we get, like, for example, in committees, we get even in APPGs, a lot of like big national organizations, right? Like Women's Aid are massive, they're an umbrella organization, the secretariat, and they obviously cover quite a large reach in terms of geography. But I think it's also important to try and engage other groups that might not necessarily have that sort of representation in Westminster and in Parliament. And I'm quite keen also to ensure that we involve in these conversations women who experience domestic abuse, women who experience gendered violence, and I think all victims of domestic abuse, whatever their background, women or not, to try and bring that in, particularly sort of student level, higher education, that sort of age range and group as well, because I feel from a distance it's a little bit missing. You know, we do get a lot of opportunities to take feedback evidence from big national organizations, and they bring a lot of expertise, but I think it's also important to get perspectives from other places.
Yeah, thank you. I think, yeah, as we're sort of coming to an end now, and we're getting close to 8 o'clock, we'll probably close there. So thank you so much, Apsana, for joining us today. I think we've all learnt a lot from this conversation, and it's been really inspiring to think more about the public health approaches we need and the role of education, so many things we've discussed. So hopefully we'll remain in touch, as you said, and we can sort of look to potentially working together more in the future. Speaking of the future, our groups are actually currently recruiting. So for the students who are here today, I think both KCR Sexpression and Students for Global Health are currently hosting elections. So if you're interested, please do check out our pages on KCLSU, and we'd love to have you join us on committee. If you've got any questions, do get in touch. I'm sure our teams are more than happy to provide any information on any roles. I think with that, we'll end the event. So thanks again to everyone for joining, and especially to Apsana for speaking for us today.
Thanks so much, and I'll make sure the team drop you an email and we can stay in touch. Thank you, everyone.
Definitely. Thank you so much.
Thank you.